This week, you're going to be working on creating a proposal for your team projects. Um, this section here talks about proposals in general. So there are two categories that pretty much all proposals are going to fall into. One would be that of research, and one is goods and services. Goods and services obviously is the one that we're working on in this class, but you may also find yourself at some point having to do a research proposal. And in that case, you or a team would be tasked with carrying out research for some particular reason. Perhaps it's to understand the scope of a problem, and whether or not it is something that your company would need to find a solution for. Or perhaps it's just to understand context and background before a larger presentation about a particular good or service that your company is creating. But there are all kinds of research. I mean, maybe you're in an academic field and you are proposing a research project that you would do to then write up as a paper to be published or a presentation to give at a national conference or something. So there are all kinds of research-based proposals. And goods and services include a bit of research in them as well, but their purpose and their focus is a little bit different. So as you know, that you've been asked to identify a problem, a real world problem, and to propose a potential solution for that problem. And you've been asked to also write up a description of that solution, that product and or service that your team has decided to pursue as the solution. And now you're going to share that information in a much larger, more detailed way as you create a proposal that will lay out your plans for creating this product or service. One thing you really have to remember is that a proposal is an argument. You are arguing for, in the case of research, for the research to be done. You're arguing that it is a necessity for that research to be done. For goods and services, you're arguing that there is a problem, that the problem has tangible, identifiable consequences, and that you can create a good or service to address that problem in some way. So you are creating an argument, which means you need to pay attention to elements of persuasion in this document. Your argument is going to give an understanding of the context. It's going to show that you have the determination, that you've determined to pursue this project, that you have planned and are in the process of planning this project, and that you have the ability to carry it out. You are also demonstrating your professional commitment to this project, both yours on a personal level, a team level, as well as the company that you work for. So all of these things need to be taken into consideration when you are developing your proposal. Every proposal needs to address these two questions. When it comes to the problem, how can you define the problem or opportunity so that readers will understand it? There's no point in writing about it if you're not writing in a way that readers can understand it. So not just how can you define it, but how can you define it so that your readers can understand it, which, as we've said all along in class, you have to know your audience. You are writing this as if it were, and we'll be talking in more detail about what these are, but as if it were an internal memo. So within a company that you would already be a part of, you are creating this proposal. You have to take into account then what kinds of people do you have who would be reading this memo? Who would you have to convince? A supervisor, a board of some sort, advisory board, or a financial board of some sort? You know, who is it that you're having to convince of this particular proposal that you are creating? You really need to understand that. You need to understand your audience and your purpose. And then you can go on to looking at your content, which is, you know, and everything that you create, which, you know, your solution is then going to be a part of. So when it comes to the solution, you need to really think about, and not just think about, but you have to communicate these things in your proposal. How has the problem decreased productivity or quality? And how would your idea address these effects? So think in, you know, in terms of this problem, what are the effects of this problem? You can't just say there's a problem. You have to explain why it's a problem. How does it affect people? And then how is your solution going to work to alleviate those effects? The proposal needs to include a detailed description of what you as a team plan to do and what procedures, equipment, and schedules are necessary to carry out the plan. That's kind of a basic, a basic description of what your proposal needs to have. You also need to take into consideration various cross-cultural concerns, especially if you were dealing with a multicultural audience, as far as your readers of your proposal. Say your company works, you know, in many different locations in different countries with different customs and languages. You may need to consider cross-cultural concerns if the consumers, those who would be purchasing or accessing somehow your goods and services, would, you know, are they multicultural in any way? So you want to make sure that you are paying attention to these cross-cultural areas in particular. Persuasion. Different cultures have different methods of persuasion. There are things that would be persuasive in one culture that might not be so persuasive in another. So understanding the cultures that are involved will help in determining how best to present your argument, the persuasive elements of your argument. Thinking in terms of language, is there a need to have anything in any part of this proposal translated into another language? If so, then you would need to budget time for that. Now, maybe it's not the proposal itself. Maybe it is parts of the project, parts of the development of the product, or the way the service is accessed or carried out. Materials that support it, you know, an infographic that explains how to use it, instruction booklets, what, you know, various things like that. If those need to be translated into another language, you need to make sure that you would allow time for that and that you would have the resources available to get those translations done. And that may also be a budget concern that you would that you would need to pay attention to. Graphics. When it comes to graphics for cross-cultural audiences, multicultural audiences, the best rule of thumb is to keep them simple and to provide simple captions. Remembering that sometimes some images don't translate the same way in other cultures, other environments. So a simple caption can help make your intended meaning more clear. And likewise with sentences, it's important to use shorter sentences and to stick to common vocabulary words. So if you have any technical terms, or if you have any terms that are, more regionally used than universally used in English, you want to make sure you find the most common term and use that one. When it comes to things like writing dates and other like punctuation and spellings, you want to go with the local conventions. So for, American audiences, you're going to use our normal American jumbled up dates and conventions and that. But if you were including, say, a European or Asian or African audience in your proposal, then you want to make sure that you are using the conventions of that local environment. For example, in some areas of the world, when you write dates, it's common to begin with the year and then the month and then the day. So you're going from larger to smaller unit of time. And in others, it's more common to go from day to month to year. And then, of course, we have Americans who like to go month, day, year, which is probably the least logical of the conventions that are more common. So it's also important to remember to write months out. So if you're talking about June 13th, you would want to write out June instead of writing it as the number 6. Because that's another thing, if you're writing like 06-13-22, that could get a little bit confusing, although that one's not so bad. It's really the first 12 days that are the problem. Because if you were to write 06-12-22, in some countries that would be interpreted as the 6th of December 2022. So where you might mean it as June 12th, 2022. So just make sure that you pay attention to the conventions and alleviate as much confusion as possible by writing out the name of the month instead of using the numerical representation for it. And then, as with anything you write, you want to have somebody read it, somebody outside of your team read it in advance to make sure that it makes sense, that everything is clear, that the conventions have been followed appropriately. So in this case, in any of those target audiences, you would want a representative to read it and make sure that everything is okay before you would submit a final version. And that's just really should be a standard part of a good writing practice, especially for professional writing, so that you can make sure you're putting forth the best work that you have. Speaking of the best work that you have, you want to convey professionalism in all aspects of your proposal and your proposal writing. So you want to make sure that you communicate your qualifications, your team's qualifications. A good proposal is going to have a section that is just about the qualifications and work history of the team members, unless it's a very, very large team, and then it might just be the project lead and maybe like the co-leader or just the top kind of 2 or 3 people on the team. And it might also include some information about the company and the kind of work it's done before to show that the overall company has the credentials and history. You would include your what kind of quality control measures that you're going to be taking to ensure that the project proceeds smoothly, that the work is done correctly, that if there are any problems, that those are addressed as soon as they come up, that kind of stuff. So you want to make sure that you pay attention and have set out a plan for quality control as you go. Scheduling. You need to develop a realistic work schedule. It doesn't do any good for you to assure your superiors that you can get a project done in 2 weeks, knowing that it's more likely to take 4 to 6 weeks. Because then when those 2 weeks are up and you don't have your project finished, you have to keep justifying to your supervisors why you need to take more and more and more and more time. Whereas if you had just said at the beginning that the project will most likely take about 6 weeks, and then, hey, you happen to finish in 4 and everything is great, you've given yourself plenty of time and you've been upfront about that. And so the people who are evaluating your proposal can say, oh yeah, okay, 6 weeks makes sense based on the schedule that we see you have here, the plan, the scope of the work. So 6 weeks, yes, we can allow 6 weeks for this project. It's part of integrity, and it's part of being an ethical professional. And the same thing goes for the budget aspect, developing a realistic budget. Don't try to give a low quote just for the sake of having a better chance of your proposal being accepted. Be realistic. Really do the research into the costs of things and the costs of labor and the costs of correcting any mistakes as you go, and develop that realistic budget so that you don't have to keep going back and asking for more, or so you don't feel like you have to start cutting corners to make up for some of the areas that you went over budget. So we'll stop there with the overview and we'll save the proposal structure for the next video. The important things to take away from the overview is that you are creating a proposal for goods and services, products and services, that you are keeping in mind that this is a persuasive document. You are paying attention to cross-cultural concerns that would affect the way you prepare this document and the way you would create your product, and that you remember to be professional and show integrity throughout.